The Hermit Nation, A History of Korea. In 1882, the American author, preacher and orientalist William Elliot Griffis published his latest book. It was entitled Korea, the Hermit Nation. The term Hermit Nation caught on in the years that followed, and indeed it has been used to describe many other countries since that are very isolated from the rest of the world, and about which little is known because so few foreigners visit them. Places like modern-day Turkmenistan, Eritrea, or Equatorial Guinea. It was a particularly apt description for Korea. What Griffis was trying to convey was the fact that Korea had been cut off from the rest of the world for centuries, in the way that a hermit in centuries gone by might isolate themselves from the world living on a remote island or in seclusion in the desert. His reason for this description was that centuries earlier, the Joseon Dynasty of the Kingdom of Korea had intentionally chosen to cut itself off from contact with the European powers that had begun arriving to the Far East from the 16th century onwards. Although the technological and military power of Western countries like the US, Britain, France and Russia meant that Korea could no longer fully maintain its isolation. By the time Griffis was writing in the early 1880s, it is significant that he viewed Korea in this way. Indeed, nearly a century and a half later, Korea still retains many features of a hermit state. While South Korea is open to the world and one of the great economic and technological success stories of the 20th century, North Korea is still basically a hermit state, ruled by a secretive family, a military dictatorship, and a country that few outsiders visit. How did Korea develop this strange political culture, at once a part of Asia, and yet one with a desire to live apart from the rest of the world? Here we explore the history of the Hermit Nation. From the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, there is evidence of humans being present on the Korean peninsula as far back as around 400,000 years ago. This comes from sites like Jeongok-ri and Jeongok-ri, where hand axes and various pointed tools made out of stone have been unearthed by archaeologists. Crude methods of doing so began to evolve gradually from around 100,000 BC onwards, and by the late Paleolithic, running roughly from around 40,000 BC to the end of the last ice age, in 10,000 BC, there were more complex instruments appearing. These included, for example, stone scrappers that could be employed to scrape down animal hides for use in various ways. Hunting and gathering remained the primary means of subsistence well into the Neolithic or New Stone Age era, after the Ice Age ended. It was not until around 4000 BC that agriculture began to really take over in Korea as the primary means of acquiring calories, and society consequently became more sedentary in villages and even small towns. By then there was a well-established tradition of pottery making in Korea, a key marker of early societal development in any Neolithic society. The late Stone Age persisted here until into the second millennium BC. Perhaps a cause of the relatively late adoption of agriculture was that there simply was a greater amount of easily available food sources for hunter-gatherers. For instance, archaeological evidence points towards a heavy reliance on seafood and fish in a region which is surrounded by water and has numerous large rivers. Bronze Age Korea. The Bronze Age began in Korea around the middle of the second millennium BC. By then, the first coherent state or power had emerged on the peninsula. This was known as Joseon and is understood to have ruled over a significant part of the Korean peninsula for a period of 2,000 years between the late 3rd millennium BC and the start of the 2nd century BC. As such, Joseon was more of a culture like that of ancient Egypt, rather than a single sustained state, although later accounts claimed that there was considerable dynastic continuity over this immense period of time in Korea. It is hard to get a full sense of how the history of Joseon developed. For instance, one of the key accounts of the history of this Bronze Age power is found in the memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, a key source for the history of ancient Korea. The problem is, this was only written down from oral tradition in the 13th century AD, and so purports to be recording evidence from the history of the Joseon state thousands of years earlier. Joseon covered much of the northern half of the Korean peninsula, while a separate state, Jin, began to emerge on the southern half of the peninsula from around 300 BC onwards. As such, there was already an interesting divergence between northern and southern Korea over 2 millennia ago. This is broadly geographical, as northern Korea is more open to influences from the north and west, in Manchuria and China, while southern Korea had a more distinct maritime nature and is open to the wider Yellow Sea and Western Pacific. As with so many other parts of the world where the earliest major powers began to emerge, Joseon and Jin were more like confederacies of small cities and towns than centralized kingdoms or empires. They gradually became more centralized over time, but there was nothing in Korea to rival a major power like Han Dynasty China during the same period in the late 1st millennium BC. The four commanderies of Han, the power of Han Dynasty China, comparative to the federations of city-states in Korea, is significant, for it was during the era of the Han Dynasty that Korea first experienced a period of considerable Chinese cultural influence and political domination. Eastern China along the course of the Yellow, Yangtze and Pearl Rivers had been one of the foremost centres of civilization anywhere in the world since the 3rd millennium BC. It had been partially unified on several occasions, and then crumbled again into warring states over the centuries. Then, in the 3rd century BC, Emperor Qin Shi Huang had united China under his strong rule and initiated a cultural and social renaissance in China. His dynasty was quickly succeeded by that of the Han. The Han dynasty would rule China as a centralized state that dominated large parts of modern-day China between 206 BC and 220 AD. It was the first of the truly powerful ancient Chinese imperial dynasties, and it was during this time that Chinese culture and power began radiating out to other parts of the Far East and Southeast Asia. The first region to experience Chinese imperialism and the attendant arrival of Chinese culture was Northern Korea. Beginning in the 2nd century BC, the Han began to take over the lands of the Joseon in the region. Before long, 4 administrative zones of Chinese influence known as the Four Commanderies of Han had emerged. These were Leilang, Lintun, Xuantu, and Zhenfan. The Leilang Commandery in particular, which covered an area where Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, is today, remained the core commandery of Chinese influence over many centuries. The Three Kingdoms. The period of Han influence in the north of the Korean peninsula was followed in the middle of the 1st millennium AD by the emergence of the so-called Three Kingdoms. There were actually 4 kingdoms early on, in the 1st millennium AD. The largest was Goguryeo. This emerged as a Chinese-influenced state that ruled over all of central and northern Korea, along with a substantial block of territory further north into Manchuria. It was deeply influenced by Chinese society as a result of the period of Chinese rule here under the Four Commanderies, and so the government of Goguryeo had more advanced bureaucratic and organisational methods acquired from the Chinese. Moreover, religious and philosophical movements like Buddhism and Confucianism, which shaped many elements of society around them in terms of architecture and belief systems, had arrived to Goguryeo by the middle of the 1st millennium BC. Further south in southern Korea, there were initially 3 smaller kingdoms. These were Baekje, Silla and Gaya. While they were smaller, they controlled the richer ports and maritime trade routes that were developing at this time between China and Japan and benefited therefrom. Eventually, Gaya was swallowed up, and so Goguryeo, Baekje and Silla are the 3 powers that are generally referenced when the 3 kingdoms are brought up. These ruled over Korea down to the 7th century. The 3 kingdoms came to an end as the Tang dynasty reasserted their control over Goguryeo in the 7th and 8th centuries. The Goryeo dynasty and the Mongols. The next centuries were formative in the development of Korean identity. Until this time, there had been no unitary Korean state. Numerous states had ruled different parts of the peninsula from time to time, and the Chinese had ruled over parts of northern Korea for significant tranches of time. What happened in the post-Three Kingdoms era was the southern kingdoms began to gradually unify and expand northwards, as Chinese influence yet again waned after subsuming Goguryeo. This occurred as China faced its own incursions in the west and north of the country from various Turkic groups like the Uyghurs during the great age of Turkic migrations that changed the ethno-linguistic landscape of much of Asia in these centuries. It meant that a distinct Korean state emerged in the 9th and 10th centuries, one which ruled over all of what are now North and South Korea. The dynasty that ruled this new kingdom was the Goryeo dynasty. It was from an anglicised rendering of this term that the modern Western word for Korea derives, Goryeo having been Romanised as Korea by European writers. It is in turn derived from the earlier state Goguryeo. The Goryeo dynasty ruled over Korea for around 470 years, between the start of the 10th century and the late 14th century. This was a period of remarkable growth and cultural flowering in Korea, during which many of the foundational texts and artworks of Korean society were produced. A good example of this is the Tripitaka Koreana, a vast collection of Korean woodblock printed plates containing over 80,000 printed pages and constituting more than 6,000 books. Long before the printing revolution began in Europe in the middle of the 15th century, this enormous collection of written material was produced using woodblock printing methods on the other side of Eurasia. The strength of the Goryeo unitary state was seen as well in the 13th century at the time of the Mongol conquests. Although the might of imperial China crumbled before the onslaught of the Mongols, and China ended up being ruled by the Mongolian Yuan dynasty for over a century in the 13th and 14th centuries, Korea resisted successive attempted invasions of the Korean peninsula between the 1230s and the 1250s. Admittedly, the Goryeo dynasty government did eventually begin paying tribute to the Mongols to get them to stop raiding into their lands. Korea was not conquered by the Mongols, a nomadic people who otherwise managed to build an empire that stretched from Ukraine to China. The Joseon Dynasty. The long rule of the Goryeo dynasty continued down to the end of the 14th century. While it could withstand the Mongols, what ultimately overthrew it was a threat from within. In the middle of the 14th century, civil war racked Korea, in which the royal government was opposed by a general by the name of Yi Seong-gye. After a decades-long struggle, he eventually secured full control over Korea and ascended as King Taejo, first of the Joseon Dynasty, in 1392. The term Joseon Dynasty was a rendering of the much earlier state of Gojoseon that had ruled over much of Korea during the Bronze Age. The Joseon would rule Korea for slightly more than half a millennium and oversaw the period in which pre-modern Korean society and culture reached its peak. We have extensive records of the history of these centuries, as the Joseon court employed historians and scholars who produced great works of literature and history. Amongst the foremost are the veritable records of the Joseon Dynasty, an analytic year-by-year account of events that occurred under Joseon rule between 1413 and 1865, almost the entirety of the period of Joseon rule. It was also during Joseon rule that Confucianism became central to Korean society and brought with it a certain code of behaviour which has characterised attitudes in Korea, China and Japan down to the present day in different ways. Everything from new poetic forms and music to art, and the production of fine porcelain flourished under the strong rule of the Joseon. At the same time, over a period of 5 centuries, the Joseon rulers, of which there were 27 between 1392 and 1910, faced many periods of peril and uncertainty. This was especially true of the late 16th and 17th centuries. In the 1590s, even though it was experiencing its own internal turmoil at the time, the Japanese lords attempted to invade and conquer Korea, beginning a long tradition whereby Japan began to pose as great a threat to Korean autonomy as China traditionally had. At the same time, the first European missionaries, explorers and merchants were beginning to appear in Korea following the Portuguese discovery of the sea route to Asia around Africa at the very end of the 15th century. It was a century later before Europeans began arriving in any numbers to Korea, but they soon brought problems in terms of their disruption of traditional Korean life. Finally, for several decades in the first half of the 17th century, China was racked by civil war as the Qing dynasty, that originated in Manchuria, just north of Korea, sought to topple the Ming dynasty. This inevitably caused disruptions to Korea. Owing to all of these factors, in the middle of the 17th century, the Joseon rulers actively began isolating their kingdom from outsiders, creating the Hermit Kingdom. In some ways, this replicated actions taken by the Chinese and Japanese who sought to limit European intervention in their nations by restricting access to their countries to just a handful of ports that Portuguese and Dutch merchants had access to. Yet in other ways, Korea's form of isolationism was more extreme than its larger neighbours. Korea would remain a mystery to much of the wider world through the late 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries. It was during this period of European intervention in the Far East that Christianity was first introduced into Korea. Indeed, the spread of the European religion was one of the main reasons why Korea, Japan, and China eventually began trying to limit the freedom of movement of the Europeans in their countries. They were right to be fearful. Christianity caught on in Korea, and in subsequent centuries, especially from the second half of the 19th century onwards, Christian missionaries managed to convert substantial parts of the population. South Korea today is one of the most Christianized countries in Asia as a result. The struggles of the Hermit Kingdom. The Joseon Dynasty would continue to rule Korea until the start of the 20th century, making them one of the longest reigning royal dynasties in history. Few other families had claimed a throne in late medieval times and held it until the dawn of the 20th century. However, from the middle of the 19th century, they were experiencing difficulties. Korea, China, Japan, and a number of other powers in Indochina and elsewhere in the Far East had managed to remain largely aloof from the spheres of influence of the European powers during the age of exploration and colonization between the 16th and 18th centuries. Things changed, though, towards the middle of the 19th century. The advent of the modern steamship and numerous other technological innovations meant that the power of nations like Britain and France were now extending to the furthest reaches of the world, and the governments of even great nations like China were seemingly powerless to stop them from interfering in their affairs. China, for instance, lost the First and Second Opium Wars to the British between the late 1830s and the end of the 1860s. This left the British, for example, in charge of Hong Kong and with influence over China's trade policy. As the Joseon government watched on at these developments, it, like the Qing dynasty in China, began considering ways to modernize their country in order to resist the Western powers. If they could acquire Western weapons and systems of government, perhaps they could adapt to the threat posed by the British and French. For the Koreans, though, the greater threat would prove to be their close neighbour. While China and Korea's modernization programs proved half-hearted, after the Meiji Restoration in Japan in 1868 and the overthrow of the medieval Tokugawa shogunate, the Japanese embarked on a remarkable process of modernization. Soon they were not only able to resist British, French, and American efforts to exert influence over them, they were also seeking to expand as an imperial power themselves. Their first target was Korea. The First Sino-Japanese War occurred in the mid-1890s and involved Korea. It ended with Japan establishing some influence over the country. The last semi-independent Joseon ruler, King Gojong, responded by declaring the establishment of a Korean empire in 1897, with himself as the Gwangmu Emperor, but this provided only a temporary respite. The Japanese forced him to abdicate in 1907, and 3 years later, in 1910, they annexed Korea into the Empire of Japan. Korea was, along with what was called Formosa at the time, but which we now call Taiwan, the first major enclave of the expanding Japanese Empire. In 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria in northeastern China and turned it into the puppet state of Manchukuo. Then in 1937, they attacked the rest of China, commencing a war which could be seen from the Far Eastern perspective as the start of the Second World War in the Western Pacific, 2 years before any fighting began in Europe. Throughout the conflict, the Korean people were subjected to a brutal form of rule. Hundreds of thousands of Korean men were conscripted into the military. Much more onerous was the effective use of millions of Korean men and women as semi-slave labourers in Japanese factories and on Japanese farms during the war. Korea also became the primary source of what have euphemistically been termed comfort women in the history of the war, essentially women who were forced into Japanese brothels or to act as mistresses for Japanese soldiers and military officers during the war. The half-century of Japanese oppression of Korea only came to an end with the defeat of the Empire of Japan following the dropping of the atomic weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The Korean War. The end of the Second World War brought no real respite for Korea. In the final weeks of the conflict, the Soviet Union honoured a wartime agreement which it had made with the United States, whereby it would declare war on Japan within 3 months of the defeat of Nazi Germany in Europe. Exactly 3 months after the final victory against the Germans, the Russians invaded the Japanese-occupied territories in Manchuria and also advanced into the Korean peninsula. This created a problem concerning Korea. Long before the war had ended, the Soviets and the Western Allied leaders like Winston Churchill, had been debating what their respective spheres of influence would be in liberated regions once the war ended. For instance, in Europe, it was concluded that Poland would fall into the Soviet and Communist sphere after the war, and in return, the Western Allies acquired influence in Greece after the war. In Korea, an agreement was reached whereby the peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel, the 38th line of latitude north of the equator. The Soviets would control northern Korea as communist sphere of influence after the war, and the United States would oversee the southern part of the peninsula. Effectively, what both countries did in the years that followed was install a dictator in charge of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, known more commonly as North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, known simply as South Korea. In the case of North Korea, this was Kim Il-sung, a Korean who had spent many years in China fighting for the communists there, while Syngman Rhee, who was installed as the authoritarian leader of South Korea, had been a Korean nationalist and independence fighter since the beginning of Japanese rule in his homeland back in 1910. The two Koreas developed gradually into two distinct states in the late 1940s. There were talks of unification, but as the Cold War heated up, the chances of this occurring peacefully became more and more remote. Instead, the Korean War soon erupted. The cause of this conflict seems relatively simple in retrospect. In 1949, the long-running Chinese Civil War, which had been underway between the Chinese Communists and the Chinese Nationalists, or Kuomintang, had ended when the Communists defeated the Nationalists on the Chinese mainland, and the surviving elements of the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, where they established a rival Republic of China that persists to this day. The United States had not intervened in the final years of the Chinese Civil War to aid the Nationalists in any meaningful way, in large part because the leadership of the Nationalists had been incredibly corrupt during the Second World War and had stolen vast sums of money, which the Allies funneled to them, ostensibly to aid in the fight against the Japanese. As a result of this, Kim Il-sung became convinced that if he invaded South Korea, the US would also not seek to come to the aid of the South Koreans, much as they had ignored the situation in China in 1949. Thus, in the summer of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, the start of the Korean War. Initially, the North Koreans had everything go their way. 3 days after the invasion commenced, they captured Seoul, the capital of South Korea, on the 28th of June. Then they continued southwards, and by August had nearly overrun the entire peninsula. However, the South Koreans held onto enough territory to allow the United States, along with a large alliance of other Western powers, to launch an expeditionary force to Korea. In late September, the US and their allies retook Seoul and then invaded North Korea, capturing the northern capital, Pyongyang, in October 1950. At this juncture, fearing the complete overthrow of the communist government in North Korea, the new government of the People's Republic of China, led by Mao Zedong, intervened and invaded North Korea, providing aid to the North Koreans. With Chinese aid, the North Koreans surged southwards again and retook Seoul in January 1951. This dispensation only lasted for 2 months before the US and South Koreans recaptured the city for the second time in March 1951. Thereafter, the Korean War began to turn into a stalemate fought along the 38th parallel. By the summer of 1951, peace negotiations were underway. In July 1953, an armistice was agreed whereby the border would be fixed along the 38th parallel and a demilitarized zone would be established there. But theoretically, North Korea and South Korea remain at war to this day. Full peace terms have never been agreed, only an armistice. The South Korean miracle. Since the end of the Korean War in 1953, South Korea and North Korea have developed along radically different lines. South Korea went through 3 prolonged dictatorships. Syngman Rhee ruled down to 1960, when a wave of democratic protest led to a short-lived republic. It was overthrown a year later in a military coup, which was led by Park Chung-hee. Then, once he was assassinated in 1979, after an 18-year dictatorship, Chun Doo-hwan seized power. It was really only following a democratic transition that Roh Tae-woo became the first truly democratic leader of post-war South Korea as president between 1988 and 1993. South Korea has been a democracy ever since. Despite this period of prolonged authoritarian rule, South Korea experienced an incredible period of economic growth in the second half of the 20th century, sometimes referred to as the miracle on the Han River in reference to Seoul being built on the Hangang River. In particular, during the extended dictatorship of Park Chung-hee, South Korea began developing as a manufacturer of small electrical goods. This led to incredible economic growth, sometimes reaching 12% or 13%. GDP growth annually in the 1960s and 1970s. This in turn laid the groundwork for the development of much more complex, indigenous electronic and automotive companies such as Samsung, Hyundai, Kia, and LG. Today, South Korea is considered to be the 13th largest economy in the world, well ahead of countries of a similar size population, like Argentina, and eclipsing countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, and Bangladesh, that have substantially larger populations. North Korea, the modern-day hermit state. North of the 38th parallel, the situation could not have been more different. Under the rule of the Kim family dictatorship, North Korea has remained a very poor and underdeveloped country. Kim Il-sung ruled down to his death in 1994 and was then succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il, followed by his grandson, Kim Jong-un, in 2011. Under their rule, North Korea had nominally remained a communist state, but in reality it is simply a highly authoritarian military dictatorship. It is impossible to ignore the country's longer political culture when evaluating North Korea. It is the modern manifestation of Korea's much older reputation for being a hermit state, a country cut off from the rest of the world, secretive and unknown. Few outsiders visit North Korea, and little is known about life there in some respects. It is hard to assess its economic performance comparative to South Korea, for the simple reason that there are so few economic statistics or reliable data of any kind available for the country. What is known is that its people remain poor and highly repressed, and that a terrible famine even struck the country in the 1990s, killing several million people. However, the Kim family dictatorship has endured. This is owing to its brutality at home in crushing any resistance to its rule, and also because in 2006, the regime carried out its first successful nuclear weapons test. Since then, it has developed a complex nuclear and ballistic weapons program, and is also known to have chemical and biological weapons. This has ensured protection for the regime. While crushing economic sanctions have been levelled against the government in Pyongyang by the West, they will not attempt to overthrow the Kim dictatorship, knowing that Seoul could be hit by a nuclear weapon within minutes of any attack on North Korea. Where to from here? Where might the two Koreas go from here? No political, social, or cultural state is permanent. Eventually there will be a change of situation for two countries, which still officially remain at war with one another. For decades, the average person would probably have assumed that eventually cracks would start to appear in the North Korean Kim family dictatorship, especially after the Cold War came to an end, and many regimes that had claimed to be communist during the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union saw their dictatorships overthrown, or a gradual transition to democracy. Yet that is not what has happened. The Kim family dictatorship's control over North Korea seems as strong today as it has ever been, even though many international observers initially viewed Kim Jong-un, who became the new head of state following his father's death late in 2011, as a foolish character who seemed more interested in building the world's largest DVD collection than maintaining his family's iron grip on the state. They were proved quite wrong in this assessment. Kim has emerged as a ruthless leader who has solidified his family's power and strengthened its nuclear deterrent to the point where no country, not even the United States, can really consider trying to engage in regime change in North Korea. The risk of a rapid nuclear attack on a city like Seoul or Tokyo is simply too great for a regime change of the kind undertaken in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 and 2003 to be considered, and there appears to be no major opposition movement against Kim from within North Korea that might change the regime internally. On top of all of this, North Korea continues to have a couple of powerful allies on the international stage, especially Russia, whose war in Ukraine the hermit state has contributed to in recent times. Conversely, while South Korea has been one of the great economic success stories of the post-war Far East, the country's image as a model of prosperity and stability in Asia has been called into question in recent times. Remember, this is a country which, even as it was beginning to experience economic success in the second half of the 20th century, was often ruled by de facto dictators, It was therefore worrying when the president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, declared the imposition of martial law on the 3rd of December 2024 in an apparent attempt to acquire greater control over the state. Although his efforts failed and he is facing criminal charges as of the summer of 2025, the entire incident pointed to the surprising way in which South Korea might be more vulnerable to political instability than North Korea in a rapidly changing world. Who knows where things will go from here? In an evolving Cold War-type clash between a rising China and a declining United States, South Korea might continue to become more vulnerable as its traditional pro-American stance leaves it increasingly isolated in the region next to China, Russia, and North Korea. It is not inconceivable that South Korea has to begin to adopt a new international stance. If China tries to take over Taiwan, or if the rising populist movement in Japan also leads to a shift in its political outlook. Then again, it is not unimaginable either that there is some unknown palace intrigue in North Korea that could lead to a sudden shift in its internal politics, especially if it returned to the kind of economic crisis that occurred in the mid-1990s, when millions of people died from famine after the collapse of Soviet aid. The country's politics is so secretive that it is impossible to guess what might happen there. One thing is for certain: whether it is a year from now, 10 years, or a century, there will come a day when the current state of affairs on the Korean peninsula changes, for better or worse.